The Syndicate of Riven Worlds did not take prizes out of cruelty. This was a distinction they maintained with some care, in the way that institutions maintain distinctions that justify the gap between what they do and what they would prefer to be remembered for doing. The Syndicate was, in its own accounting, a research organization, the oldest continuously operating xenological research body in the known galaxy, founded 312 years ago by a coalition of species who had decided, after 2 centuries of stumbling into each other across the stars with results ranging from uncomfortable to catastrophic, that the systematic study of alien biology, psychology, and military capability was preferable to the alternative of learning about it the hard way. The hard way being, in the Syndicate's diplomatic phrasing, unstructured contact events, which was what they called wars. They took prizes because specimens degraded, because a culture's true nature could not be fully understood from signal intercepts and long-range observation alone. Because the most important data, the data that told you not just what a species could do but how it thought, what it feared, what it valued, what it would sacrifice and what it would not, required proximity. Required in some cases direct acquisition of subjects and materials that the subject species would not voluntarily provide. The Syndicate had rules about this. Extensive, carefully written rules, reviewed and updated on a 12-year cycle by an ethics committee whose membership rotated across the Syndicate's 11 founding species. The rules specified which categories of acquisition were permissible and under what conditions. They specified the treatment of acquired subjects. They specified documentation protocols, review processes, and the conditions under which acquired materials were to be returned or, the word the rules used was retired, which was its own kind of distinction, disposed of. The rules were, by any reasonable external assessment, better than nothing. They were not, by any reasonable external assessment, good, but the Syndicate had maintained them for 312 years, and in that time had produced the most comprehensive xenological database in the known galaxy, and had used that database to prevent, they kept count, because the count justified the methods. 47 unstructured contact events that their models projected would otherwise have occurred. 47 wars that didn't happen because the Syndicate understood the relevant species well enough to predict the flashpoints and intervene before they ignited. This was the accounting they used. It balanced in their internal mathematics against the cost of the methods. The ethics committee reviewed the accounting every 12 years and, with some modifications and with a rotating roster of dissenting opinions that were formally noted and formally set aside, concluded that the balance held. The acquisition of the human vessel, Perseverance, was approved by a 3-member subcommittee on a Tuesday, logged in the acquisition registry as Case 7441, and assigned to lead researcher Oren Vell with a target completion window of 18 months. Nobody on the subcommittee had read the full intelligence file on human psychology before approving it. The file was long, and the subcommittee's calendar was full, and the summary assessment at the front of the file, prepared by a junior analyst who had been working from second-hand sources and had never had direct contact with human materials, described the species as technologically capable, emotionally complex, hierarchically organized, and likely to respond to acquisition with a combination of distress and compliance consistent with most sapient species at equivalent technological development levels. The summary assessment was wrong in several important ways. The subcommittee, not having read past it, did not know this. The Perseverance was a survey vessel, not military. The distinction mattered, and the Syndicate's acquisition protocols required that non-military vessels be prioritized over military ones wherever possible, on the reasonable grounds that acquiring a military vessel was significantly more likely to produce an unstructured contact event with the species in question than acquiring a civilian. One, it was a mid-sized ship, 140 meters in length, crewed by 22 humans on a deep field geological survey of a system 3 weeks transit from Earth. The system was unremarkable, a dim K-type star, with a handful of rocky planets and a moderately interesting debris field that the survey team's preliminary scans had flagged as potentially containing rare isotope concentrations worth a closer look. The Perseverance had been in the system for 11 days when the Syndicate acquisition team arrived. The acquisition itself took 4 minutes and 16 seconds. The Syndicate team's technology was, in this specific domain, considerably in advance of anything the Perseverance could have deployed in response. A suppression field that neutralized the ship's drive systems and communications simultaneously, followed by a physical boarding through a breach point at the ship's secondary airlock. The crew of 22 was secured without physical injury, which the acquisition protocol required, and which the team achieved without significant difficulty. The Perseverance's captain was a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka. She was 44 years old, a geologist by training who had cross-qualified for command on her third deep field posting and had been running survey operations for 11 years. She was, by any measure relevant to the situation, not a military officer. She had no combat training beyond the basic emergency response certification that all survey crew carried. She had a crew of geologists, data analysts, a medical officer, and 2 engineers. She was also, and this is the detail that lead researcher Oren Vell would later describe in his incident report, with a specificity that suggested he had spent considerable time looking for a more clinical way to phrase it, the single most composed person in any room she occupied, in a way that he found from the very first moment of contact genuinely difficult to interpret. When the suppression field dropped and the boarding team entered through the secondary airlock, Tanaka was already in the corridor outside the bridge. Not running, not armed, standing, with her hands in a position that the boarding team's protocols recognized as non-threatening, watching them come down the corridor with the quality of attention that you give to something you are studying, rather than something you are afraid of. She said, in a language that the boarding team's translation equipment identified as English and rendered approximately, "I assume you're going to want to talk to whoever's in charge." That's me. The boarding team's commander, a Syndicate field officer named Keth Darrow, had conducted 14 acquisitions over his career. He had never had an acquired subject meet him in the corridor and open with that specific sentence. He processed it for approximately 2 seconds, then said that yes, he would like to speak with her, and that she and her crew would be transported to a Syndicate research facility for a period of study. Tanaka said, "How long?" Darrow said, "That depends on the research requirements." "Typically 18 months, Tanaka said. "I see." And then, after a pause that Darrow later described as containing more thinking than most pauses he had experienced in the field, "I'd like to make a communication to my government before we leave." "That won't be possible," Darrow said. "Communications are suppressed during the acquisition phase." "After the acquisition phase?" "That depends on the research protocol." Tanaka looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "All right. Can I get my crew together before we go? I'd like to speak with them." Darrow considered this. It was an unusual request. Acquired subjects typically either complied silently or required active management. A request to address the crew before departure was not in the standard protocol, but it was also not in any way threatening, and Darrow had enough field experience to know that acquired subjects who felt they had some agency in small matters were significantly easier to manage in large ones. He said yes. He would think about that decision later, in the reconstruction, and conclude that it had been the right call operationally, and also that it hadn't made any practical difference to what followed. Tanaka gathered her crew in the Perseverance's common area, a rectangular room that smelled of coffee and the particular institutional comfort of a space that people had been living in for weeks. 21 people arranged themselves in the available seats and on the counter edges and in the doorways, and they looked at their captain, and their captain looked back at them with the same quality of composed attention she had given the boarding team. She said, "We're going to be taken to a research facility. I don't have full information on the timeline or the conditions. What I know is that this organization has done this before with other species, which means they have protocols, which means they're manageable." She paused. "I want everyone to remember 3 things. First, we are scientists. Observation is what we do. Whatever situation we're in, we can learn from it. Second, they took us because they want to understand us. That means they need us intact and functional, which is leverage we have whether we use it or not. Third," she paused again, and something shifted in her voice, not loudly, but in the way that a key change shifts a piece of music without interrupting it. "Every one of you was chosen for this posting because you are the best at what you do. That hasn't changed. Act accordingly. She didn't say, "We'll be fine." She didn't make promises about outcomes she couldn't guarantee. She gave them a frame and trusted them to work within it. Keth Darrow, standing at the doorway with two of his team, watched this and filed it under the category he had been developing since the corridor, a category he did not yet have a name for, which was itself unusual. After 14 acquisitions, he had a name for most things he encountered in the field. The Syndicate's research station Verath was located in a system that did not appear on any human navigational chart, which was partly by design and partly simply the result of being very far from anywhere that human survey missions had yet reached. It was a large installation, the Syndicate's primary xenological research hub, housing active studies on 11 species simultaneously, with a permanent research staff of approximately 300 and a rotating population of acquired subjects that varied depending on the current acquisition schedule. The station was not a prison, in the Syndicate's accounting. Acquired subjects had individual quarters, access to common areas, nutritional provision calibrated to their species requirements, and a structured daily interaction schedule with the research team. They were not harmed. They were not isolated. They were studied, which was different from imprisonment in ways the Syndicate's ethics committee had documented at length, and which the acquired subjects, in the Syndicate's experience, did not always find the documentation convincing. The 22 humans from the Perseverance were installed in a dedicated habitat section on the station's 4th level, which had been prepared in advance based on the intelligence file specifications for human environmental requirements. The temperature, atmospheric composition, light cycle, and nutritional provisions were all within acceptable human parameters. The quarters were small but functional. The common area was adequate. Lead researcher Oren Vell conducted the initial orientation interview with Tanaka on the 2nd day. He was a careful researcher, 48 years old by Syndicate standard reckoning, with a reputation for methodological rigor and a publication record that was the longest in his department. He had overseen 6 previous acquisition studies, all of them producing data that the Syndicate's archive considered significant. He approached the human study with the same structured professionalism he brought to all his work. He sat across from Tanaka in the interview room, a neutral space, neither threatening nor comfortable, designed to reduce environmental variables, and opened with the standard orientation briefing. He explained the Syndicate's purpose and its history. He explained the research protocol and what it would involve. He explained the timeline and the conditions under which the study would be concluded. Tanaka listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Can I ask questions?" "Of course," Vell said. He had a standard set of responses prepared for the questions that acquired subjects typically asked. He had been doing this long enough to know what those questions were. Tanaka asked, "How many species have you studied this way?" "The Syndicate's acquisition database contains studies on 63 species," Vell said. "And the humans you're studying, us right now, we're the first humans in your database?" "You are the first human acquisition, yes. So your intelligence file on us was compiled without direct contact." "That's correct." "From signal intercepts and long range, who wrote the summary assessment?" Vell paused. "The summary assessment was prepared by our xenological analysis department." "A junior analyst," Tanaka said. "Based on second-hand sources," Vell looked at her for a moment. "How did you—" "Because it's what I would have done with the data available," she said. "And because if a senior analyst with direct contact experience had written it, you probably would have approached this differently." She said it without accusation. "As an observation, I'm not criticizing the methodology. I'm trying to understand the baseline you're working from, so I know what gaps there are in your current model." Vell looked at her for a long moment. In 22 years of research, across 6 acquisition studies covering 4 different species, he had never had an acquired subject open an orientation interview by auditing his research methodology. "The gaps," he said carefully, "are what the study is designed to address." "Right," Tanaka said. "So let me save us both some time. I'll tell you what your summary assessment probably got wrong, and you can tell me if I'm right. And then we can spend the next 18 months studying the things your file doesn't cover, instead of the things it already has approximate data on. That's more efficient for both of us. Vel set down his documentation tool. He looked at her with an expression that, on a Syndicate researcher's face, represented something not commonly observed in the orientation interview: genuine surprise. "Go ahead," he said. What Tanaka told him, over the course of the next 3 hours, was not a negotiation and was not a resistance strategy. It was, with a precision that Vel found increasingly difficult to categorize, exactly what she said it was: an audit of the gaps in his model. She was right about most of them. The summary assessment had described humans as emotionally complex, without specifying what that complexity looked like under stress. The stress response models derived from the assessment predicted a combination of anxiety, reduced cognitive function, and increased compliance as the primary adaptive response to captivity. What the assessment had not accounted for, what it could not have accounted for, working from signal intercepts and without direct contact, was the specific way that human stress response interacted with human social structure. Humans, Tanaka explained, did not become more compliant under stress. They became more organized. The stress response in the specific conditions of captivity with intact social bonds, which is to say, with the crew together rather than isolated, triggered a cooperative optimization that looked, from the outside, like calmness but was functionally a different thing. It was the calmness of a system running at higher efficiency than its baseline, not lower. The crew of the Perseverance was not calm because they were not afraid. They were calm because they were afraid and had channeled that fear into function. Vel wrote this down. Then he looked up at Tanaka and said, "You're describing your own stress response to me." "In clinical terms?" "Yes," she said. "Why?" She considered the question with the same deliberateness she appeared to bring to everything. "Because the study is going to happen regardless. If it happens with bad baseline data, you'll draw wrong conclusions, and those conclusions will go into your database. And the next time your organization interacts with humans, whether through acquisition or through something else, those wrong conclusions will inform the interaction. That's bad for everyone." She paused. "Also, I find the research interesting. I'm a scientist. You've put me in an environment full of data I've never had access to before. I'd be wasting it if I spent 18 months being uncooperative." Vel looked at her for a long time. Then he said, with the carefully measured candor of a researcher who had just encountered something that required him to revise a significant number of assumptions, "Dr. Tanaka, I want to be clear that your cooperation, while valued, does not change the nature of the acquisition. You were brought here without your consent, and that—" "I know what it is," she said. "I'm not pretending it's something else. I'm making the best available use of the situation I'm in." She looked at him with an expression that he later, in his incident report, described as simultaneously the most cooperative and the most unsettling thing I encountered in 22 years of research. That's what humans do. The first 30 days of the study produced data that the Syndicate's xenological database categorized, in its automated intake assessment, as significantly divergent from predictive model. This was a classification that the database used when incoming data deviated from the pre-study projections by more than 40%. In 6 previous acquisition studies, Vel had received this classification twice. Both times the divergence had been in specific, bounded areas, a species' pain threshold or its sleep architecture, or its communication sub-frequencies that required targeted model revision. The human study's divergence was not specific or bounded. It was structural. The first indication was behavioral. The crew of the Perseverance, in the standard isolation protocol that the Syndicate used for the first 2 weeks of acquisition studies to establish behavioral baselines, had not produced the expected isolation response. Standard sapient species in isolation showed predictable degradation curves, reduced activity levels, increased passivity, social withdrawal even in the presence of other members of their group. The humans showed the opposite. In the absence of external input, they generated their own. They organized schedules, divided responsibilities, created informal research projects using the materials available to them. And this was the observation that Vel flagged first. Because it was the most unusual, they began, systematically and without being prompted, to study the station, not overtly, not in a way that triggered security responses, They asked questions during interaction sessions with the research staff, practical questions, about the station's systems and layout and population, phrased as the natural curiosity of people who wanted to understand their environment. They noted details in the common areas during their authorized movement periods. They compared notes in their quarters, piecing together a picture of the station's architecture from the fragments available to them. Vel noticed this on day 19, when he reviewed the interaction session logs and cross-referenced them with the movement records, and realized that the humans' questions, taken individually, appeared innocuous, but taken together described a systematic survey that was mapping the station's fourth level with considerable accuracy. He brought this to station security, which elevated the observation to the security director, who reviewed it and concluded that the humans were not, based on current data, attempting to escape or to acquire dangerous materials. They were simply, in the security director's phrasing, which carried a specific quality of uncertainty, learning things about their environment, comprehensively and methodically and without apparent strategic end. The security director suggested enhanced monitoring and no other action. Vel agreed because what else could you do with subjects who were learning things, and because the data produced by the systematic mapping behavior was itself interesting. He added a note to the study file. Subjects exhibit environmental analysis behavior consistent with scientific methodology rather than escape planning. Cannot rule out that the two are the same thing from the subject's perspective. The second indication was social. The Syndicate's research protocol included regular structured interactions between the research staff and the acquired subjects, interviews, behavioral assessments, physical examinations, cognitive evaluations. These were standard procedure, designed to produce the data categories that the study was commissioned to fill. What was not standard procedure was what happened during those interactions after the first month. The humans began with a gradual consistency that Vel only recognized as a pattern in retrospect, asking the research staff personal questions, not invasive questions, nothing that violated the interaction protocol's boundaries, but genuine questions about the researchers' backgrounds, their areas of specialization, their opinions on their own work, about the Syndicate's history and structure, and the specifics of how the ethics committee functioned, about the other species in the database, and what the researchers had found most surprising about them and the researchers. This was the part that Veli identified as the core of the second indication and began answering not all of them, not immediately, but over the course of weeks in ways that accumulated into a pattern. The research staff assigned to the human study began having conversations with the acquired subjects rather than conducting assessments of them. The line between researcher and subject, which the protocol was designed to maintain with specific structural supports, was blurring. Not breaking. No one was violating the formal rule, but blurring, in the specific way that lines blur when one party treats them as boundaries and the other party treats them as suggestions. The humans were not manipulating the researchers. Vel considered this possibility carefully and rejected it, not because he thought humans incapable of manipulation, but because what he observed did not have the signature of manipulation. It had the signature of genuine interest. The humans appeared to actually want to know about the people studying them, in the same way and for the same reasons that they appeared to actually want to know about the station's layout. They were curious. Comprehensively, methodically, apparently inexhaustibly curious about everything around them. The curiosity was not strategic, or not only strategic, but it was producing strategic outcomes regardless of intent. The research staff was developing relationships with the subjects, and relationships changed the nature of the study in ways that the protocol had not anticipated and that Vel did not immediately know how to address. He called a department review meeting on day 47 and laid out what he was observing. The 4 researchers most involved in direct subject interaction sat across from him, and he looked at their faces, and their faces had the specific quality of people who know they have crossed a line and are not entirely sure how they got there. "They're interesting," said one of the junior researchers, a young Syndicate analyst named Faceless, who had been assigned to cognitive evaluation and who had, over the past 3 weeks, spent approximately twice the allotted time in interaction sessions with 3 of the human crew members. "I know that's not I know the protocol says interaction should be structured and bounded, Vel said. Yes. But they ask, Aaron stopped. Started again. Dr. Vel, in the other acquisition studies I've reviewed, the subjects ask questions about their situation, about when they're going home, about what the study involves, about the conditions of their captivity. The humans don't ask those questions. Or they ask them once and then they accept the answers and move on. And then they ask about the research, about what we're finding, about what we think about what we're finding. A pause. Researcher Vel, they asked me what I find meaningful about this work. And you answered. I answered, Aaron said. And the tone of it had the quality of someone confessing something they are not entirely sure requires confession. And then they told me what they find meaningful about their work. And it was another pause. Very similar, actually, in structure if not in subject. Vel looked at his junior researcher for a long moment. Then he said, document everything. Every interaction, every question, every response. This is data. Unexpected data, but data. Yes, sir. And maintain the protocol boundaries. Yes, sir. The boundaries maintained themselves for approximately another 2 weeks, which was longer than Vel had expected and shorter than he had hoped. The third indication was the one that Vel elevated to station management, because it had operational implications that moved it outside the scope of his study and into the scope of the station's broader functioning. On day 63, the station's chief engineer, a Syndicate technical officer named Sor Malin, who had been running the station's physical plant for 11 years, and who had, in the course of several authorized interaction sessions with the human engineering staff, developed a professional respect for their technical competence that she later described as the most natural thing she had ever felt, discovered that the human engineers had identified a flaw in the station's secondary life support redundancy system, not a critical flaw. The station would not have failed catastrophically, but a flaw that Sor Malin, reviewing the analysis that the human engineers had quietly compiled over the previous 3 weeks, using information gathered during their authorized environmental familiarization sessions, confirmed was real and had been present in the station's systems for approximately 4 years without being detected by the Syndicate's own maintenance protocols. The human engineers had found it in 3 weeks, without access to the station's technical documentation, without any equipment beyond what was visible during their authorized movement periods, using the kind of systematic observational methodology that Tanaka had described in the first orientation interview as simply what humans did. Sora Malin brought the analysis to station management. Station management brought it to Vel. Vel read it and then sat for a while looking at the document, which was 43 pages long and written in precise technical language that his translation software rendered accurately, and thought about what it meant. The humans had been in the station for 63 days. They had been formally studying its 4th level for 19 of those days, and informally gathering data from the moment of arrival. In 63 days, without access to any of the station's official systems, they had mapped the 4th level's layout, developed a comprehensive understanding of the station's social structure and personnel relationships, established genuine connections with at least 6 members of the research staff, and identified a 4-year-old flaw in the secondary life support system. They had done all of this while cooperating fully with the study protocol, while answering Vel's questions with apparent candor, while being, by any behavioral metric the study could apply, the most cooperative acquired subjects in the Syndicate's 300-year history. He thought about what Tanaka had said on day 2. I'm making the best available use of the situation I'm in. That's what humans do. He had interpreted that at the time as a description of an individual coping strategy. He was revising that interpretation now. He requested a private meeting with Tanaka on day 64. She arrived at the interview room and sat across from him with the same composed attention she had brought to every previous interaction, and he set the 43-page engineering analysis on the table between them and watched her look at it. Your engineers gave this to Sor Malin, he said. Yes. Why? Tanaka looked at the document for a moment. Because the flaw's real and it needed to be fixed. If the redundancy system failed in certain conditions, people on this station could be harmed. We weren't going to sit on that. You could have used it, Vel said, as leverage. as a bargaining point for improved conditions or early release. We could have, Tanaka agreed. We didn't. Why not? She looked at him with the expression that he had come to recognize over 64 days as the one she wore when she was deciding how to be honest about something complex. Because that's not who we are, she said. We found a safety problem. People fix safety problems. That's not strategy. That's just what you do. She paused. Also, using it as leverage would have changed the nature of our relationship with Sor Malen, and she's been decent to us. We're not going to burn that for a tactical advantage. The relationship with Sor Malen, Vel said carefully, and with Fess Aaron, and with researcher Dio, and with the medical staff. Tanaka said it plainly. We're not pretending those aren't real. They are real. We're not going to use people we've come to know as instruments. Vel looked at her for a long moment. Dr. Tanaka, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead, what are you doing? Not the individual behaviors, the mapping, the engineering analysis, the staff relationships. The overall strategy. What is the goal? Tanaka was quiet for a moment. Then she said, there isn't a strategy. Or there is one, but it's not the kind you're thinking of. She looked at him steadily. We're doing what we always do. We're paying attention. We're learning everything we can about where we are and who we're with and how things work. We're being useful wherever we can be useful. We're building relationships because relationships are how things get done, and also because people are interesting and we actually want to know them. She paused. And we're waiting. For what? To see what kind of people you are, she said. We didn't know anything about the Syndicate before this. We know a great deal more now, and what we know is informing what we do next. What you do next, Vel said. While we're still in this station, she confirmed. And after. Vel's report to station management on day 67 was the longest document he had produced in 22 years of research. It ran to 214 pages, including appendices, and its executive summary, which was the part that station management read first, and which was the part that was subsequently escalated to the Syndicate's Central Research Committee, contained a section that he had rewritten 6 times before settling on language he considered both accurate and appropriately weighted. The section was titled Preliminary Assessment Risk Classification Revision. In it, he recommended that the Syndicate's classification of humanity be immediately elevated from its current designation, technologically capable, emotionally complex, manageable acquisition subject, to a classification that the Syndicate system had only used 4 times in 312 years, reserved for species whose interaction with the Syndicate's standard protocols produced outcomes that were not harmful but were fundamentally different from what the protocols were designed to produce. The classification was called Active Contextual Adapter. What it meant, in practical terms, was a species that did not respond to a given environment but responded to its understanding of a given environment, and that the understanding updated faster than the environment could be modified to account for it. In plain language, you could not control what the humans did by controlling the conditions they were in, because the humans were continuously learning the conditions faster than the conditions could be changed. Any containment strategy based on environmental management was, for this species, not a containment strategy. It was a study opportunity that the humans would use to improve their understanding of the containment. The report also noted, in a subsection that Vel had not expected to write when he began the study, that the humans had not attempted to escape, had not threatened any member of the research staff, had not engaged in any behavior that caused harm to anyone on the station, and had in fact materially improved the station's safety by identifying the life support flaw. They were, by every behavioral metric except the one the Syndicate had not thought to measure. Rate of environmental comprehension. Model acquired subjects. He ended the report with a recommendation that he had spent the longest time writing, because it had no precedent in the Syndicate's 312-year history, and because making it required him to say something that the Syndicate's institutional culture was not designed to accommodate easily. He recommended release. Not because the study was complete. It was not. Not because the humans had met any formal condition for release. The protocol specified 18 months and they were at 67 days. But because, in his professional assessment, Continuing the acquisition served neither the Syndicate's research interests nor any reasonable ethical standard. And because the humans had demonstrated in 67 days that what the Syndicate could learn from them through acquisition was considerably less than what the Syndicate could learn from them through an approach that they would voluntarily participate in, he filed the report and waited. The Syndicate's Central Research Committee met an emergency session 8 days later. Vel attended via remote link from Station Varath, which was unusual. Department heads were not typically included in Central Committee sessions, and which he interpreted as a signal that the committee was taking the report seriously. The session lasted 4 hours. Vel answered questions from 11 committee members, fielding queries about his methodology, his data, his reasoning for the risk reclassification, and his recommendation for release. Most of the questions were procedural, the committee working through the implications of a recommendation that had no established process to follow, because the Syndicate had never released an acquired subject at 67 days before. One committee member, a senior researcher named Dav Orath, who had been on the committee for 20 years and who had, in that time, developed a reputation for asking the questions that other members preferred to leave unasked, waited until the procedural questions were exhausted, and then said, "Researcher Veli, in your report, you describe the humans as presenting no threat and causing no harm. You describe them as cooperative, curious, and genuinely interested in the research. You describe their environmental analysis as scientific rather than strategic. And then you recommend immediate release and reclassify them as the most significant category in our risk registry. I want to understand the logic." Vel had been waiting for this question since filing the report. "The risk is not from what they're doing," he said. "The risk is from what they're learning. Every day they're on this station, their model of the Syndicate improves. They understand us better. They understand how we work, how we think, what we value, what our protocols are, and where the gaps in those protocols are. They're doing this without hostility and without apparent strategic intent. They're doing it because it's what they do. It's not a risk in the sense of danger. It's a risk in the sense of asymmetry. 67 days from now, the humans on Station Varath will understand the Syndicate better than the Syndicate understands humanity. And in 18 months, the gap will be significant. And releasing them resolves this asymmetry how?" Davorath asked. "It doesn't," Vel said. "The asymmetry exists regardless. What releasing them resolves is the question of what they do with what they know." He paused. "Right now, we have 22 humans who understand a great deal about the Syndicate's methods, facilities, staff relationships, and operational vulnerabilities, and who have no particular reason to want good things for us. If we release them, honestly, immediately, with an acknowledgement that the acquisition was a wrong we committed, we have 22 humans who understand a great deal about the Syndicate, and who have a reason, however small, to view us as capable of correction. Those are very different outcomes. You're arguing for release on ethical grounds and dressing it in strategic language," Davorath said. "I'm arguing for release on both grounds," Vel said. "I find that in this case they point in the same direction." The committee voted. The vote was 7-4 in favor of release, with the 4 dissenting members filing formal objections on procedural grounds that Vel later read and found technically accurate and practically irrelevant. He told Tanaka the following morning. She was in the common area when he arrived, sitting at a table with 3 of her crew members, all of them apparently in the middle of a technical discussion that involved a hand-drawn diagram on a piece of paper that Vel recognized from the layout geometry as a section of the station's 5th level that the humans had not had authorized access to. She looked up when he came in. Then she looked at his face, and whatever she read there made her set down the diagram and give him her full attention. "We're releasing you," he said. "All 22 of you. We'll provide transport back to your home system. It'll take approximately 3 weeks." Tanaka was quiet for a moment. The 3 crew members at the table with her said nothing. The common area, which had the particular quality of a space that is still because it is listening, was very still. "The study isn't complete," she said. Not a question. "No? Why?" He sat down across from her, which was not in the release protocol but which felt like the appropriate thing to do, because the study should not have begun the way it did, and because continuing it serves no legitimate purpose that couldn't be served better by an approach you'd agree to. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That took courage to write." "The recommendation? It took a committee vote," he said, 7-4. "Still." She looked at the diagram on the table for a moment, then back at him. "What happens to the acquisition program? Generally." "That's outside the scope of my recommendation," Vel said. "The Central Committee will review the program in light of the risk reclassification and the study findings. I don't know what they'll decide." "What do you think they should decide?" He thought about that. About 312 years of acquisition studies. About 47 prevented wars. About the accounting that the Ethics Committee reviewed every 12 years and always found sufficient. "I think," he said carefully, "that the accounting has been done with incomplete information. Specifically that the studies have been measuring what the Syndicate learns from acquired subjects, but not what acquired subjects learn about the Syndicate, and that for most species the asymmetry doesn't matter, because most species respond to acquisition by becoming less capable. But for a species like yours, the asymmetry matters a great deal," Tanaka said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to make a proposal." He looked at her. "Go ahead." "The Syndicate wants to study humans. We understand that. The database you're building has genuine value for preventing wars, for improving interspecies relations. We're not opposed to the goal." She paused. "But you've learned in 67 days that the acquisition method produces bad data for our species. Because we adapt to the acquisition, and what you're studying becomes the adaptation rather than the baseline." She looked at him steadily. "Let us come voluntarily. Send a request through our government. Explain what you're trying to learn and why. Offer genuine reciprocity. We study you while you study us. I guarantee you'll get better data than anything the acquisition protocol could produce, because you'll be studying humans who aren't channeling their cognitive resources into environmental mapping and relationship building as coping strategies." Vel looked at her. "You'd participate voluntarily in a study that is designed to identify your species' vulnerabilities. We'd participate voluntarily in a study that is designed to improve interspecies understanding," she said. "The framing matters. And yes, because we already know our vulnerabilities better than you ever would from 67 days of acquisition data, and because the best way to make sure that information is used appropriately is to be in the room when it's discussed." She paused. "Also, frankly, because your database is extraordinary, and we'd like access to it. Reciprocity goes both ways." Vel looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I'll include the proposal in my follow-up report." "Good," Tanaka said. And then, after a pause that had the quality of something that had been waiting to be said, "Researcher Vel, in 67 days we've learned a great deal about you. Your organization, your methods, your people. I want you to know, and I want you to take this back to your Central Committee, that what we found was mostly people trying to do something genuinely useful, using methods that have serious problems, in an institution that has been too comfortable to question itself." She said it without anger, the way you say something that is true and important and that the person hearing it needs to be able to receive. That's not a condemnation. That's an observation, and it's the kind of observation that can be the basis for something better, if you choose to use it that way. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Dr. Tanaka, when this is over, when you're back on Earth and this has been through whatever political and diplomatic process it goes through, I'd like to formally request your participation in the voluntary study program." "If it's approved," she looked at him, and something in her expression changed, in the small, specific way that things change when a genuine offer is made and genuinely received. "I'll think about it," she said, and then, "Probably yes." The Perseverance crew returned to Earth on a Tuesday 79 days after the acquisition, aboard a Syndicate transport vessel that they had spent the 3-week journey learning everything they could about, in the systematic and apparently inexhaustible way that Vel had by now accepted, was simply how humans spent their time in unfamiliar environments. The political and diplomatic response was, by any standard measure, significant. The United Earth government filed formal protests through every available channel. The Syndicate's Central Committee, which had anticipated this and had prepared a response package that included the release as a demonstration of good faith, the Vel report as a demonstration of self-criticism, and the proposal for a voluntary study program as a demonstration of constructive intent, managed the interaction with the care of an institution that had been managing difficult diplomatic moments for 3 centuries, and had learned, at some cost, when to lead with the gesture rather than the argument. The formal negotiations that followed lasted 8 months. They produced an agreement that established, for the first time in the Syndicate's history, a fully voluntary research partnership with a species, a program in which humans participated by choice, with full disclosure of research objectives, with reciprocal access to the Syndicate's database, and with a joint ethics committee that included human representatives for the first time. The acquisition program for human subjects was formally suspended. The broader acquisition program was placed under a comprehensive review that would take 2 years and produce recommendations that, when implemented, changed the Syndicate's methodology more significantly than any single event in its 300-year history. Vel led the new voluntary partnership program from its first day. Tanaka served as the human government's primary liaison to the program for 3 years, which was longer than she had planned and shorter than she later thought it should have been, given everything that needed to be built from scratch. Fess Aaron, the junior researcher who had spent twice the allotted time in interaction sessions with the human crew, was promoted to senior researcher and assigned to the Human Partnership Program, which was where his particular combination of genuine curiosity and professional rigor turned out to be exactly the right fit. He and 2 of the Perseverance crew members published a joint research paper 18 months into the program, the first jointly authored Syndicate human publication in either species' academic history, on the subject of comparative stress response, optimization in high uncertainty environments. It was very well received. The account of the Perseverance acquisition circulated through the region's diplomatic and academic communities with the speed that significant events circulate when they are both genuine news and useful precedent. The Syndicate, in an unusual departure from its traditional information management practices, did not attempt to contain it. Vel's recommendation was that transparency served the Syndicate's long-term interests better than control, and the Central Committee, which had spent 8 months watching the diplomatic resolution unfold with results considerably better than their models had predicted for the confrontational alternative, was inclined to agree. The account reached the Velthari Ascendancy, where Danis Oro read it with the attentiveness he brought to all human-related intelligence, and added a note to the Ascendancy's human file that said, simply and see also, the Kareth Reckoning. Pattern consistent. The account reached the Garathi Dominion, where Commander Beltaris, who had by this point completed his full assessment of the Dominion's open archive vulnerability and was midway through the implementation of the security reforms. His report had recommended, read it, and found himself thinking about his own observation from the withdrawal. We walked into a room where they'd been watching us through the window for over a year, and we thought we were arriving unannounced. He added a note to his own file that said, "The room doesn't have to be a military engagement. The window doesn't have to be a sensor array. The pattern is consistent regardless of context." The account reached, eventually, a researcher at a university in a civilization that had never had direct contact with humanity, and was unlikely to for at least another century, given the distances involved. The researcher was writing a comparative study of first contact methodologies across the known galaxy, and the Perseverance case was, for her purposes, an extraordinary data point, not because of the acquisition itself, which fit a pattern she had documented in 7 other cases, but because of what happened in the 67 days between the acquisition and the release. She wrote, in the concluding section of her study, that the Perseverance case represented the clearest example she had found of what she termed reflexive adaptation. The tendency of a species to respond to a novel environment, not by adjusting behavior to fit the environment, but by comprehensively learning the environment and then making decisions about whether and how to fit it. The distinction, she wrote, was significant because it meant that the environment could not be controlled as a management tool. It could only be understood as a negotiating partner. She found this, as a researcher, genuinely interesting. She also found it, as someone who had spent 20 years studying the ways that interspecies contact went wrong, quietly important to document for any civilization that might find itself tempted to try the acquisition approach with this particular species. She finished the study and published it in her university's research journal, where it was read by approximately 400 specialists in the field and ignored by approximately everyone else, which is the fate of most important research and which she had long since made her peace with. On Station Vareth, in the habitat section that had been converted from an acquisition holding area to a voluntary research partnership suite, after the formal agreement was signed, there was a common room that smelled of coffee, a human import that had become, over the course of the partnership program's first year, a fixture of the station's social life that several Syndicate staff had developed a genuine appreciation for. On a wall of that common room, someone, it was never established who, and the question was asked often enough that it had become a running joke among the station's permanent staff, had written, in both English and the Syndicate's common research language, a sentence that Vel had once said in an orientation debrief, and that had apparently lodged itself in someone's memory and eventually found its way onto the wall. The sentence said, "The subject who studies you back is not your subject." Below it, in handwriting that several people recognized as Tanaka's, was a second line that had been added later, sometime during her third visit to the station as the voluntary program's human liaison, in the casual way that something is added when a thought is too complete to leave unfinished. It said, "They're your colleague. Act accordingly."